Let me start by just saying that I'm sure this map that I've put together is not entirely correct. Like, I feel like I could redraw this or redo it like 1,000 times, and I would never be perfectly happy with it. In particular, the stuff around industrial complex and pipe yard are just like so precise and finicky with the requirements they have to meet that I'm never going to be perfectly happy with how that's laid out. And I don't know, maybe somebody will come up with some genius idea of how to put this together that I haven't thought of, but I couldn't come up with anything better. So I'm sure this map is not entirely accurate, but it's as accurate as I'm going to get it. In with this video, I'm including the full GIMP project file, so if anybody else wants to download this and try their hand at improving it or, visually embellishing it or doing whatever, if you want to reuse it in any way, feel free, go ahead, do whatever you want with it. This whole map is talking about downpour cannon. A lot of the evidence we're talking about here comes from downpour. Watcher adds basically nothing to this. So with all that said, to start with, we have 5 different pieces of evidence about the way the rain world, about how Five Pebbles facility is laid out in-game. One of which is the actual, in-game regions we explore, the perspectives of the camera we have, how the rooms are connected together, and so on. Essentially the in-game map. We have this image from Outer Expanse where we're seeing from the top of the tree in Outer Expanse near the Slugcat's home, looking towards Five Pebbles. We also have this other map that's shown by Five Pebbles to Gormand right before he unlocks the gate to Outer Expanse. That gives us a top-down view of the whole facility, and we'll talk a lot more about this map in a moment, but it's particularly interesting, I think, to note that we see the red circles on the map with the dashes through them, which, given the context of when Five Pebbles shows this map, that it's right before he unlocks the gate to Outer Expanse, surely that's what those red circles are. The karma gates, the locked karma gates, which is also very interesting because that shows us that while we might think there's one gate in and out of the facility, we can see here there's actually 10. And you notice it's not even symmetrical, like the top right there's actually a gap in the retaining wall there, and there's 2 karma gates on either side. Then we have the stated place relations in-game. This is various dialogue from Looks to the Moon and Five Pebbles, sometimes when they're talking to you, sometimes when they're commenting on pearls, where they tell you how various regions are related to each other. In particular, we hear that Looks to the Moon is east of Five Pebbles, Farmerays is west of Five Pebbles. That one actually uses really specific phrasing. Five Pebbles says, go west past the Farmerays. We'll come back to that. Subterranean is south of Looks to the Moon. Outer Expanse is west of Five Pebbles. Farmerays is west of Looks to the Moon. And Chimney Canopy is west of Looks to the Moon. And Sky Islands is west of Chimney Canopy. And then finally, and the most difficult one, Pipe Yard is north of Farmerays. And that's actually one of the most concrete facts because both Looks to the Moon and Five Pebbles say that very clearly. Okay, so that's our 4th piece of evidence. And then the final piece of evidence we have for the layout of this map is a quote from the developers, specifically talking about the precipice in the exterior that was added in Downpour. Okay, so first of all, when we're looking at this map, I want to try and identify what the various elements of this map are before we go in extreme detail here. So, starting with the obvious, we have Five Pebbles and Looks to the Moon in the center connected by the 2 precipice bridges. The dev quote explicitly confirms there are 2 precipice bridges. It explicitly confirms this exact relation between the superstructures as well. So we also know, based on both the dev quote and also Five Pebbles and Looks to the Moon, saying that Looks to the Moon is east of Five Pebbles, that the one on the left here is Five Pebbles, the one on the right is Looks to the Moon, and that also means that this whole map is roughly aligned where north is up and south is down. It could be on a slight tilt, maybe, but almost exactly north is up and south is down. So that's the white parts of the image. The next easiest thing to identify is the retaining wall that goes around the facility. Now, the retaining wall I don't think is very apparent when we explore Five Pebbles facility in-game. And I guess this is a good time to note, the whole thing we're looking at here is Five Pebbles' facility. Like, Five Pebbles himself is the iterator can on the left. That's the superstructure. But the whole thing is the facility containing almost everything we explore in game. In fact, the only region we explore in game outside of Five Pebbles' facility is Outer Expanse, excluding the Watcher. So the red clearly represents Outer Expanse, and that also means that very clearly the circular part is the retaining wall. In particular, I think it's the dashed part of the circle. We can't see the retaining wall very clearly in game, but we can see the retaining wall very clearly from the top of the tree in Outer Expanse. Now, also in that same image from Outer Expanse, there's another thing we can see, kind of a thorn or something sticking up from the wall. I'm assuming that's these larger parts we see in the dashed line here. It's kind of strange because in this top-down view, they appear to be quite long, whereas in the image we see from Outer Expanse, they appear to be tall, but not particularly long. So I'm assuming there's parts of them that we can't see in that perspective from Outer Expanse. The next interesting part of this image to look at is the middle circles. And when examining these inner green parts, I did some edits to this image. So the first one is this, where I've just taken the iterators and I've colored them the same color as the background. So this image here has no new information from what you've seen before, but it does make it a lot easier to see what's underneath Looks to the Moon and Five Pebbles. And we can also clearly see here that there's these light green lines overlaid on top of the background dark green lines. So I think the colors just represent the height, at least for these inner portions. As for what the shapes themselves are actually representing, I'm really not sure. Like, one thought is maybe this is the water infrastructure, because Looks to the Moon and Five Pebbles need water to feed them, and this is a map from the iterator's perspective. So maybe this is the water infrastructure, and that can make sense with some things. But it doesn't entirely make sense. For instance, it does seem like we're seeing some amount of Sky Islands and Chimney Canopy here. We'll get to that in a bit, which I don't think really has much water infrastructure in it. And also, those circles you see in the background, especially in the north, those are very large. Like, you might think those are vats of water, but they're big. Like, they're comparable in size to the iterator's legs. They're large. So they could be maybe giant towers or something, but they don't seem to be that high. I'm really not sure what those are. Another thought is that the lines could actually represent void fluid infrastructure. So, lore tidbit, I can't believe it took me this long to learn. Looks to the Moon and Five Pebbles, yes, they need water to do their bacterial processing, but their main energy source right now is coming from mass rarefaction cells, but it wasn't always. The mass rarefaction cells are actually a backup power source that rely on a finite amount of void fluid, and they pass mass through the void fluid to extract energy. But their primary power source is supposed to be that they have pipes of void fluid coming into their superstructures, and that gives them power. Somehow. That's not really explained very well. But the point is that the mass rarefaction cells are the backup power source. That's what they're relying on now because those primary void fluid intake pipes have failed. So it's possible what we're seeing here is, in some capacity, the void fluid intake system. It could be the void fluid piping. But there is a lot of variety in the image we're seeing here. So I don't think this is just the water infrastructure, and I don't think it's just the void fluid infrastructure. Actually, what I think this is showing is the parts of the facility that Five Pebbles cares about. I think it's just whatever in the facility has been built relatively recently to facilitate the construction and operation of the iterators. Because that's what Five Pebbles would care to have a map about. Kind of makes sense. And that also then means that places where there are voids in this image, where there doesn't appear to be much, it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It means that there's nothing there that Five Pebbles cares about. And by extension, probably Looks to the Moon as well. I'll also show this variation of the image, which is the same as the previous, except I also blotted out the upper level, the brighter dark, or the brighter green above that's supposedly representing a higher elevation, I colored that the same color as the background so you can see the underlaying part here. And it's kind of interesting to note here that not only is this a circle, but it's also clearly off-center, which is kind of interesting and is actually going to be relevant in a bit. Another thing to note is when this map is. Five Pebbles facility changes a fair bit over the course of time, right? It's very different between Spearmaster and Saint. This map, I'm guessing, is representing what the facility looked like in the first place. So at Spearmaster's time or earlier, which means that in particular, it would show like waterfront facility, not shoreline. But I don't think this matters too much from our perspective because we can't see that precise an amount of detail from this map. But I thought it was worth mentioning, especially because in this image, looks to the moon hasn't collapsed. Okay, let's talk about more about this shot we see from outer expanse of Five Pebbles. So it's really hard to see things through the clouds here, but we can dig into the game's files and we can extract the source images from what we're seeing here. In particular, there's three parts. There's Five Pebbles himself, there's the wall, the retaining wall, and there's the mast. The mast in the files is actually called the local spire. The custom region is called the mast, but I just refer to it as the mast. It's more fun than the local spire. So looking at this source image of Five Pebbles, we can clearly see that we're somewhat south of Five Pebbles here. We can see the southern wall, and we can see the four legs under Five Pebbles clearly showing us the orientation. Plus the fact that we don't see Moon, well, I mean, makes sense because Moon has to be on the other side of Five Pebbles, which makes sense because outer expanse is to the west and looks to the moon is to the east on opposite ends. I do think it's interesting that we clearly are positioned to the south here, especially because you would kind of naively think that the game map goes straightforward east versus west. While here, there's clearly some depth where we've traversed a bit to the south. Now, the first thing we can do using this perspective is to plot Five Pebbles' legs, and by extension looks to the moon's legs, on this map, as well as the mast. For the legs, I basically just counted out how large of a fraction of the overall superstructure we see them taking up in the image, and I just plotted them out on the map proportionally. So we can see that each leg is about 1/12 the width of the overall iterator's superstructure. And that actually fits beautifully on the map here. It looks just like you see here. I've colored a couple of Five Pebbles legs in blue because we have a quote from an iterator saying that Five Pebbles got the rot and it's running down his west and middle legs. For the mast position, I've drawn some rays coming off of Five Pebbles trying to line up the left part of the wall we see with the southern part to try and guess like where it is that we're seeing from and where the mast must be positioned. And it doesn't exactly line up perfectly with anything we see on the map here. We can see that it's much closer to the retaining wall than to Five Pebbles based on the depth filter. And we can also kind of compare it to Five Pebbles' legs and see that based on the distance, it's a bit smaller, which actually means it shouldn't be very large on the map, which is why you can see here I've colored it in only a few pixels. I got its exact position by counting these dotted segments along the wall, along the retaining wall, assuming that they match up with these segments we see in the perspective from outer expanse. Now, what else can we place here? Well, notice that there's this large void in the middle of the map where there doesn't seem to be much of anything. That's also right around the precipice bridges, so you might think that that's shoreline, but I don't actually think it is. See, if this map represents the stuff Five Pebbles cares about, and we know that shoreline is in a canyon full of water, and that before it was shoreline, it was waterfront facility, so the canyon full of water would have been right beside it, then surely this void in the middle is the canyon full of water, right? That's the water reservoir that Five Pebbles and Looks to the Moon are drinking from. That's the giant water storage site, essentially. And then shoreline is, well, the shoreline right beside it, where waterfront facility was built before Looks to the Moon collapsed. And since we know that waterfront facility was right underneath one of the precipice bridges, and we know that shoreline eventually replaced waterfront facility, we can pin that on the map. You can see the water in the center, and you can see shoreline beside it. Now, notice how I've drawn shoreline a little bit into looks to the moon. I've done that because when we explore shoreline, we go into looks to the moon superstructure to meet her puppet. Now, you notice I don't have her puppet in the center of her superstructure. I don't think there's anything in game to actually suggest the puppets are in the center of the superstructures. And I actually think the puppet is, well, right where I've put it here. This will make more sense, especially when we talk about Five Pebbles, which I guess we should start doing now. Let's go back to that dev quote. I think it's really interesting, the phrasing of this quote, especially because it kind of confirms that after the portion of the exterior we traverse, that there are two more legs. Like, looking at this map, you might naively think that the legs we're traveling between are the two in line with the precipice bridge, so that Chimney Canopy is on the west side of Five Pebbles. That's what you would assume, but if we have to be in line with the other two legs, and the whole quote talking about being three-dimensional, means that actually the exterior is going south to the southeastern leg, and that means that the wall and Chimney Canopy are on the south of Five Pebbles, not the west. Now, it's also worth noting here that you can kind of then see Chimney Canopy from Outer Expanse, but I wouldn't read too much into this, as if you look closely around the Iterator superstructure, you can see similar bridges coming off of Five Pebbles in other directions. Now, since the exterior goes south towards the wall on the south, that also means we're entering Five Pebbles from the south, which should mean that his puppet is relatively near the southeast side, which interestingly puts it basically in exactly the same place in the superstructure where we see Looks to the Moon's puppet in her superstructure. I think this is actually quite beautiful, that by the iterators being oriented like this and the exterior going north-south, that means that we enter both iterators in the same direction relative to their orientation, and their puppets are in about the same place. Also, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that the puppets are not in the center of the superstructure, since the point of the puppets is that people can talk to them. But you want then access shafts to the puppets where people can get to them easily, so you probably wouldn't want them in the middle of the superstructure where it's super hard to get to. And as I briefly alluded to earlier, we can guess where Chimney Canopy is based off of this fact that the wall is on the south. And if we're assuming that the two colors of green are an elevation map, then that kind of clearly outlines bridge here, which we must presume is Chimney Canopy. Now, two things to note about this. Firstly, there are two bridges, and I'm purely guessing which one is Chimney Canopy. As you'll see from the other regions, this bridge lines up a little nicer, but it could totally be the other one. Also, Chimney Canopy probably seems pretty narrow, and I do feel like that's a little strange, but if you do look in game, it is kind of just one bridge heading, from our perspective, left and right, from this perspective, north and south. But it is just kind of one bridge with a number of chimneys built under it. I don't know, maybe the chimney expanse extends wider, but the part that extends that high vertically is just this one part that we explore, not some vast area. And now we can also pin Sky Islands on the map. I don't know the full extent of Sky Islands here, but you gotta admit that these shapes look a lot like Sky Islands, right? They look a lot like little high elevation islands connected to each other by a variety of small bridges. That's just kind of what they look like on the map. And the fact that they then connect perfectly to Chimney Canopy is fantastic. Now, it could totally be that Sky Islands extends further counterclockwise as well. It could also be that the part further out, closer to the retaining wall, is also just Sky Islands. I don't know. It doesn't look as much like Sky Islands, but totally could be. I really just highlighted the part on this map that I thought kind of looked like Sky Islands, but I mean, it's really just a guess. And another thing we can do is we can pin garbage wastes on the map too. Obviously, garbage wastes has to connect to shoreline, and it has to lead towards industrial, which is below chimney. So this kind of makes sense. But also, interestingly, if you look at this part of the map, you can see that the dark green is kind of this like less dense ring of circles or something, which I take to mean the garbage wastes. But also remember that Garbage Wastes was quite different before Looks to the Moon collapsed. So I'm just really highlighting this region because it is distinctly different from the surrounding regions, and so I presume it represents the extents of Garbage Wastes, but I'm not really sure. Okay, so now we come to the central problem with the whole map. Like, everything up to this point, I feel like, has worked quite nicely and all just kind of fallen into place. And from here, it's not really going to. And the central problem we run into is that Five Pebbles says go west past the farm arrays to where the earth goes down to the depths. But then both Five Pebbles and Looks to the Moon say that Pipe Yard is north of farm arrays. And on top of that, we know that farm arrays is butting up against the retaining wall because, well, it's right beside Subterranean. And actually, you can kind of even see the retaining wall on the left side of farm arrays. Like, the gate between farm arrays and Subterranean kind of looks like it's in the retaining wall. That pit in Subterranean does rather seem like it's just on the outside of the retaining wall. So if farm arrays is west of Five Pebbles against the retaining wall and Pipe Yard is north of that, that kind of puts it outside of the facility, which is kind of awkward. So we're gonna have to do some finagling here. Especially because if we do naively put farm arrays west of Five Pebbles and Pipe Yard north of that, that puts it very far from industrial complex that Pipe Yard has a very direct connection to, which doesn't make a ton of sense. And so that's kind of the central problem with this map. Shoreline and Garbage Wastes are clearly on the east of Five Pebbles, farm arrays is on the west, Pipe Yard is north of it, and Industrial is somehow sitting in the middle connecting everything, and it doesn't make a ton of sense. I should mention, the in-game map does not make distances clear. You cannot clearly map screens we see to images of, say, the Iterator superstructures or anything else that we see, because the distances between rooms in-game is highly ambiguous. And that makes doing any kind of map like this require a great deal of artistic leniency, because you have to pick where in the in-game map there is great distance between the rooms and where there isn't. And that's just kind of hard to do and hard to know. But with that said, Industrial Complex does seem quite small in-game. Like, there does seem to be two different sort of towers-ish things in Industrial. They could be a long ways apart. I don't see a real reason to believe they are, and it kind of seems like Pipe Yard is directly connected to one of them. So, Industrial could be really long, but of all the regions to be really long, it doesn't seem like the one that should be. Okay, so let's actually try putting farm arrays on the map. I'm going to draw farm arrays right here, and there's a couple reasons I'm putting farm arrays right here. And please note, this is really arbitrary. Like, farm arrays could go way farther north or way farther the other way, like counterclockwise. I really don't know where the bounds of farm arrays are here, but I have it up against the retaining wall, which seems like it makes sense. It occupies a relative void on the map, which again makes sense that its infrastructure Five Pebbles probably wouldn't really care about. And it's in the more southern portion, which both allows Pipe Yard to be north of it, and it allows Outer Expanse to extend out from the southwest gate, which kind of explains why we have this more southerly perspective of Five Pebbles from Outer Expanse. There's another thing that lines up with farm arrays being here. Notice the dotted ring around the retaining wall? Pure speculation, but I rather think that's probably the wormgrass area. Like, the whole point of wormgrass, I'm pretty sure in the lore, is to keep animals out, right? Like, you have wormgrass in the farm arrays to keep animals from eating the plants, right? But they also want to keep animals out of the facility as a whole. I mean, Five Pebbles talks about this when talking to Gorman, saying the point of the gates was to keep animals out. That's why they're locked. But what about animals sneaking over the retaining wall? Well, maybe they have giant fields of wormgrass to prevent animals from doing exactly that. And those are the giant fields of wormgrass we explore on the left of farm arrays, which are what we see here in the dotted rings. Now comes relevant the fact that the underlying dark green circle isn't centered. Because, remember, from outskirts, which is called outskirts, you'd think it's on the outskirts of the facility. From outskirts, you still have to go across the entirety of the farm arrays to reach the retaining wall, including through the whole wormgrass part. So how is outskirts called outskirts if it's not even on the outskirts of the facility? Well, maybe it's on the outskirts of the dark green ring, right? That would kind of make sense. Especially since I was talking about farm arrays occupying the void here, that butts exactly up against the outskirts of the dark green ring. So we can highlight some part of the dark green ring to be outskirts. Again, the part I've picked here is kind of arbitrary. I picked this because it lines up with other things fairly well, but you can totally just pick a different part of the dark green ring to be outskirts. And now we get to the fun ones, industrial complex and pipe yard. Both of these have really weird shapes on the map, and this is the part of the map I am by far the least happy about. Industrial has to connect garbage wastes to pipe yard to shade citadel to farm arrays, all on different sides. And chimney canopy above, yeah, that too. It's all super awkward. And it's especially awkward because neither industrial nor outskirts have any apparent pillars that could be supporting sky islands. But yet, nonetheless, they clearly have to cross under sky islands to get to farm arrays. So that's awkward. So I just kind of threw industrial complex under a part of sky islands here. But I do wonder if it crosses in this gap on the right. Maybe, maybe not. Again, if there's an arbitrary distance between rooms, it could just be that we skip the pillars to sky islands, just they're between rooms. Pipe yard, on the other hand, has clear pillars to sky islands throughout the region. It's clearly directly under sky islands. And you can also see with this setup on the map, we've got pipe yard north of farm arrays and connected to industrial, which is relatively small, connected to chimney and connected to garbage wastes. So like it works, but you will notice that pipe yard is on a pretty awkward angle here. Like you enter pipe yard from industrial and then you head to the right, which from this perspective would mean the camera is pointed south, which I don't think it is anywhere else. So that's weird. And then we've also got this long, awkward connection between pipe yard and shoreline, which is the sump tunnel, which despite being an awkward shape, I think is actually fine because, yeah, the sump tunnel is really long and goes under a whole bunch of stuff. There's also a connection between pipe yard and subterranean that we'll get to. But at least the connection between pipe yard and sky islands makes a ton of sense here. Also, just for fun, I had industrial complex extend slightly over outskirts to farm arrays. That's the part I imagine is hydroponics in the Watcher. I guess that's probably not downpour cannon, but it kind of fits on the map, right? Like it kind of extends a little bit over outskirts and we get over to farm arrays, which might be what we see on the left side of hydroponics where the Watcher starts. So that's cool. Okay, now we've got shaded citadel here, which is just kind of under 5 pebbles. Though you will probably find it a little strange that I have it marked as extending so far out from under 5 pebbles and is also quite large. There's a few reasons for that. One is that in game, when you explore shaded, like the first couple rooms aren't entirely shadowed. So I think they might be extending a little bit out from under 5 pebbles. But another thing is that when you look at the underlying dark green part of the map, you can see there's this interesting shaped structure right there, this kind of concentric wibbly wobbly rings. My guess is that that structure we're seeing on the map is Shaded Citadel, or more specifically, that it's the more modern infrastructure that was built into Shaded Citadel. Because we know that Shaded Citadel is itself a very old structure. It predates the iterators. But when you explore Shaded Citadel in-game, if you pay really close attention, you can see that there are kind of two different parts to the structure. Like there's the older brickwork structure, and then there's the like more modern piping infrastructure that's been built into it. Especially, you know, like that tunnel underneath with all the monster kelp in it. Those are more modern pieces of infrastructure that have been built into Shaded Citadel, I presume, to support the iterators. And so my guess is that what we're seeing on this map here is specifically that more modern infrastructure that's been built into this Citadel. And that it's in the voids, the parts we don't see in this image, that is the older structure. Another thing to note here is that Shaded has to extend not only over to shoreline and to garbage wastes, like I've got it here, but it also has to extend under the underhang, because we know from Rivulet's campaign that the underhang is directly over top of memory crypts. Like, there's the 2 orbs in the underhang that break off full of yellow lizards, and they land in memory crypts. So they're directly above and below each other. That does seem to make the layout of the region itself somewhat awkward. Like, it has to somehow work around that southeastern leg while still having the structure connect to shoreline without passing over memory crypts, despite that expanding like the whole gap between these 2 legs. So that's kind of weird, but I don't really see another way to interpret that. Next up, we have drainage system. It connects the one side of outskirts to garbage wastes, and it kind of goes under chimney canopy. Fits perfectly in this map. That's part of the reason why I have outskirts located exactly where it is here. Drainage system just kind of goes under everything, so I don't really relate it to anything in particular on the map. It's just kind of there. Similarly, subterranean, it connects that gate from Farmerays with the cliff going to Outer Expanse all the way over to Shoreline. And along the way, it connects to Pipe Yard and to Drainage System. The connection to Drainage System here makes perfect sense. The connection to Pipe Yard actually seems maybe a little too close, which is a little strange. And the region as a whole is quite long, but I mean, I guess that makes sense. It's a long train tunnel. What do you expect? The one thing that's a little strange is that Looks to the Moon says that the subterranean transit system is south of her. Which, I mean, looking at this image, it's like, well, I mean, you can call that south of Looks to the Moon. It is, strictly speaking, to her south. It's also, strictly speaking, to her west. So that's a little weird, but I think maybe the best way to interpret that line is that it's the whole subterranean transit system that is to her south, not specifically the part we explore. I do imagine that many of the regions we explore, Sky Islands in particular, are much larger than the parts we explore in-game. And finally, we've got Outer Expanse, which is exactly where I said it was before, and Metropolis, just placed directly on top of Five Pebbles. I just kind of speculated with the layout of the paths connecting to the exterior here. I don't really know. But I did try and keep the exterior path far away from the city so that we get that kind of distant perspective we see in game. Maybe I'm going too much in detail trying to map out specific rooms that we see, and I just should have colored the whole part. But yeah, that is the map. Before I started this project, I went looking for other maps of Five Pebbles facility, and I wasn't really happy with them. They didn't really leverage this base map, and they all had some kind of problems. I'm pretty happy with this map. I feel like with all the difficult things that the map has to juggle, all the difficult relations between regions, this map does a really good job nailing it all. But I'm still not perfectly happy with it. There's some parts of this that are a little awkward. I think if I were to change anything about this map, I'd probably have Industrial Complex extend more northwest, and then have Pipe Yard up in this little area here, which would also nicely lengthen the connection to Subterranean. But that makes Industrial Complex itself quite long. So, I don't know. Like I say, I can keep fiddling with this map forever and never be perfectly happy. As is, I'm happy enough with it. And I hope someday somebody else will manage to make significant improvements to it. But we'll see.